My name is Marin Holloway, less than 24 hours after my grandfather passed away. My family wasn't sharing memories. They were arguing over his money, the house, the cabin, his savings. Nobody noticed when the attorney quietly slid a sealed envelope across the table. It had only one name on it. Mine. I thought Grandpa had left me an inheritance. I was wrong. He left me one responsibility. And before it was over, my entire family wished that envelope had never been opened. My name is Marin Holloway. My grandfather, Theodore Holloway, wasn't the kind of man who wanted attention. He spent 40 years as an accountant, volunteered at our town's public library every Thursday, and somehow remembered every birthday without ever writing them down. The church was completely full the morning of his memorial. People called him honest, reliable, the kind of man who always did the right thing. As I listened to those speeches, I smiled through my tears. I honestly believed everyone in that room had come to honor him. I was wrong. The service had barely ended when everything changed. People stopped hugging, stopped crying, stopped talking about Grandpa. Instead, I heard whispers. I wonder what the house is worth now. Did he ever update the will? I hope he finally sold those investments. I stood there holding Grandpa's framed photograph, and suddenly, it felt like everyone else had already forgotten why we were there. That was my first warning. Outside the church, I watched my father, Nolan, pull aside a man wearing a navy blazer. They shook hands. The man handed Dad a business card. Curious, I walked a little closer. Before I reached them, the man got into his car and drove away. I looked at Dad. "Who is that?" He answered a little too quickly. "Nobody important." Later, I learned he was a realtor, and Grandpa hadn't even been buried yet. While everyone waited for the procession to the cemetery, conversations became strangely practical. My younger brother, Beckett, asked who would get Grandpa's pickup truck. My sister, Delaney, wondered if anyone had claimed Grandma's jewelry. My Uncle Warren quietly asked Dad if he knew where Grandpa kept the safe key. Nobody noticed I was standing nearby. Nobody noticed how uncomfortable those questions sounded. They weren't grieving anymore. They were calculating. After the burial, everyone gathered at the church fellowship hall. Sandwiches, coffee, homemade pies. It should have felt comforting. Instead, my aunt leaned across the table and whispered, "So, when's the attorney reading the will?" Someone answered, "I heard Grandpa had more money than anyone realized." Another cousin started guessing what the lake cabin might sell for. I looked around the room. Nobody was telling Grandpa stories anymore. They were pricing his life. As people prepared to leave, a woman I'd never met walked quietly toward me. She introduced herself. "My name is Evelyn Pierce. I'm your grandfather's attorney." She smiled kindly. "Not today. But when the time is right, I'll need to speak with you." Before I could ask why, she walked away. I stood there confused. Why me? That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I found myself thinking about my last visit with Grandpa, just 2 weeks before he passed. He wasn't talking about money or property. He simply asked if I could help organize the shelves in his garage. We spent 3 hours labeling old boxes. Before I left, he smiled and said, "One day, you'll understand why I never throw paperwork away." At the time, I laughed. Now, those words felt different. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Evelyn Pierce. "Marin, the family meeting is Friday morning. Please don't be late." Then she paused. "And there's something your grandfather specifically instructed me to give you." My heart skipped. He'd left me something? I couldn't imagine what. Friday morning, everyone arrived early. Dad looked confident. Beckett joked about finally getting Grandpa's truck. Delaney whispered that she'd already measured Grandpa's dining room for her furniture. Mom quietly asked whether the cabin would sell before summer. I sat in the corner saying nothing, because none of it felt right. Grandpa had been gone less than a week, and somehow, everyone was already spending things they didn't own. Evelyn Pierce entered carrying several folders. She greeted everyone politely. Then, instead of opening the estate file, she reached into her briefcase. Slowly, she placed one small sealed envelope on the table. Across the front, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were 4 words. For Marin only. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. And for the first time that week, nobody was thinking about Grandpa's money anymore. They were wondering why he'd trusted me with something he hadn't trusted anyone else to see. Nobody spoke. Not even Beckett. Attorney Evelyn Pierce looked at me and quietly said, "Your grandfather wanted you to read it now." My hands were trembling as I broke the seal. The first sentence made my eyes fill with tears. "Marin, if you're reading this, it means everyone survived the memorial." A few people laughed awkwardly. Grandpa always had a dry sense of humor. Then I read the next line, and the room became completely silent. "I didn't choose you because you needed more money." I paused. Everyone leaned forward. Then I continued. "I chose you because you never asked me for any." I slowly lowered the letter. Across the table, my father stopped smiling. Beckett crossed his arms. Delaney looked confused. Then Evelyn quietly explained, "Your grandfather appointed Marin as the independent executor of his trust." I hadn't inherited the estate. I'd inherited the responsibility. Beckett immediately frowned. "So, when do we get our inheritance?" Evelyn calmly opened another folder. "Not yet." She explained that Grandpa's trust couldn't distribute anything until every instruction had been verified. The lake cabin, frozen. The house, frozen. Investment accounts, frozen. Even Grandpa's truck couldn't be transferred. The room instantly filled with frustration. Interesting. Nobody asked why Grandpa wanted it that way, only how long it would take. Dad leaned forward. "There has to be a faster way." Evelyn smiled politely. "There isn't." Mr. Holloway was very specific. Dad sighed loudly. "But we're family." She nodded. "Exactly. And that's why he prepared everything so carefully." That answer shut down the entire room. For about 10 seconds. Evelyn handed me a thick blue binder. Across the front, Grandpa had written, medical appointments inside were calendars, receipts, notes, appointment reminders. Everything was organized by month. Interesting. Grandpa wasn't hiding secrets. He was preserving memories, the kind nobody realizes matter until later. The next box contained journals, one for every year after Grandma passed away. I opened the most recent one. The first page wasn't about money. It wasn't about illness either. It simply read, "Today Marin stopped by after work and fixed my porch light." Then another entry. "She stayed for coffee." Then another. "She never lets me eat dinner alone." I swallowed hard. I never knew he was writing about those ordinary moments. That evening, I kept reading. Soon I noticed something strange. Grandpa wrote about everyone: Dad, Delaney, Beckett, my aunt, my cousins. Not with anger, just facts, dates, times, small moments. Like an accountant balancing a ledger. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just truth. And truth has a way of becoming very powerful. One journal entry stopped me cold. Asked Nolan to drive me to my cardiology appointment. He said work was too busy. I frowned. Dad always told everyone he never missed Grandpa's appointments. But the next page continued. Marin left work early instead. I didn't even remember doing that. Apparently, Grandpa did. The following afternoon, Evelyn unlocked Grandpa's home. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. Then she opened the refrigerator. A handwritten calendar was still hanging there. Every visit had been color-coded. Blue ink, green ink, black ink. Then Evelyn quietly explained, "Your grandfather updated this every evening." Interesting. He hadn't been keeping score. He'd simply been recording his days. As I compared the calendar with the journals, a pattern slowly appeared. The people who claimed they'd been there all the time barely appeared at all. Meanwhile, ordinary afternoons I'd completely forgotten, changing a smoke detector, bringing groceries, taking Grandpa to the pharmacy, filled page after page. I closed the journal and took a deep breath, because for the first time, I realized Grandpa hadn't left me paperwork. He'd left me proof. And I had a feeling my family wasn't going to like what those records revealed. The following Monday, Evelyn unlocked Grandpa's private storage room. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the small office behind his garage where he'd spent years balancing books and paying bills. Every shelf was perfectly organized. Blue binders, gray banker boxes, labeled folders. Even the paper clips were sorted by size. Beckett looked around and laughed. "Seriously? He saved paperwork?" Evelyn smiled. He was an accountant. He believed memories fade. Records don't. That sentence stayed with me. We opened the first banker box. Inside wasn't cash. It was copies of checks Grandpa had written over the years. Birthday gifts, college tuition, emergency loans, car repairs, medical bills. Every check had a handwritten note explaining why he'd given the money. Grandpa hadn't been tracking debts. He'd been preserving the truth. I suddenly understood why he'd trusted paperwork more than memories. Beckett leaned back confidently. "I never asked Grandpa for much." Evelyn quietly opened another folder. Inside was a copy of a cashier's check. $28,000. Memo line, down payment for Beckett's work truck. Next to it was Grandpa's handwritten note. "He promised he'd repay me when business improved. I told him not to worry." Beckett's smile disappeared. Apparently, Grandpa had remembered things he hadn't. A few minutes later, Evelyn pulled out another file. This one had my sister Delaney's name on it. Inside were university invoices, dorm payments, graduate school tuition, canceled checks. Grandpa had quietly paid nearly 2 years of expenses. Delaney stared at the paperwork. "I forgot about those." Evelyn gently corrected her. "The trust requires complete financial disclosures. Forgotten and omitted aren't always the same thing." The room suddenly felt much smaller. Dad crossed his arms. "I don't see what any of this has to do with the estate." Evelyn calmly handed him another folder. Inside was an old loan agreement. Grandpa had loaned Dad money when his construction business nearly collapsed. There was no interest, no repayment schedule, just one handwritten sentence. "Family comes before money." Dad looked down at the papers. He didn't say another word, because he'd forgotten one important thing. Grandpa never threw documents away. That afternoon, Evelyn handed me a box of old DVDs and flash drives. "Your grandfather wanted you to watch these." I expected emotional goodbye messages. Instead, they were ordinary home videos, Christmas mornings, summer barbecues, birthday dinners. Nothing unusual, until I started paying attention to the background. That's when I noticed something nobody else ever had. One 4th of July video showed everyone laughing outside. Grandpa quietly stood up carrying a heavy cooler. He smiled and asked, "Can someone give me a hand?" Nobody even looked up. Everyone kept talking. A few seconds later, I walked into the frame and took the cooler from him. I'd completely forgotten that day. Apparently, Grandpa never did. The next video was Christmas. Everyone crowded around the tree opening gifts. Grandpa softly asked, "Would someone help me find my glasses?" Nobody answered. Beckett was filming. Dad was assembling toys. Delaney was taking pictures. Then the camera caught me walking over and handing Grandpa his glasses. No one had planned to ignore him. They simply assumed someone else would help. I suddenly realized I'd been that someone else for years. 2 days later, every beneficiary received the trust disclosure forms. Simple instructions. List every significant gift, every loan, every financial assistance Grandpa had provided during his lifetime. Nothing complicated, just honesty. Everyone confidently said they'd finish in one evening. I wasn't so sure anymore. The completed forms began arriving. I compared them with Grandpa's records. The very first one belonged to Beckett. He listed only one financial gift. Grandpa's files listed 4: vehicle assistance, business equipment, emergency rent, medical bills. I checked the dates twice. Everything matched. Canceled checks, emails, receipts. For the first time, I realized Grandpa hadn't left me a family estate to divide. He'd left me the impossible task of separating memory from truth. And the hardest conversations were still ahead. The attorney scheduled one final review meeting, not to argue, not to negotiate, simply to verify every financial disclosure against Grandpa's records. Everyone walked into the conference room looking confident. I carried only one box, Grandpa's journals. Across from me sat Dad, Mom, Beckett, Delaney, Aunt Cynthia, and our cousin Easton. For the first time, I wasn't nervous, I had the truth. Attorney Evelyn Pierce projected 2 documents onto a screen. On the left, Beckett's financial disclosure. On the right, Grandpa's records. The differences weren't enormous, but they were undeniable. 1 truck payment missing, 2 emergency loans missing. Equipment Grandpa had paid for? Never mentioned. Beckett quickly leaned forward. I honestly forgot. Evelyn nodded. You'll have an opportunity to correct your statement. The trust wasn't looking for perfect memories. It was looking for honesty. Next came Dad's file. He looked surprisingly calm. Until Evelyn opened a folder labeled Business Assistance. 2018 inside was everything. Loan agreement, wire transfer confirmation, canceled checks, even emails between Grandpa and Dad. One email simply read, Dad, I couldn't have kept the business open without you. Grandpa had printed it. Dad slowly lowered his eyes. I never thought he'd save that. I quietly answered, he saved everything. Then it was Delaney's turn. She had listed most of Grandpa's help. But one payment was missing. A down payment Grandpa quietly made on her first apartment after college. She looked genuinely confused. I thought Mom gave me that. Mom suddenly looked at Dad. Dad looked at the table. Then Mom whispered, No. Your grandfather insisted we never tell you. Silence. For the first time, this wasn't about greed. It was about forgotten sacrifices. Evelyn brought in one final banker box. Across the top, Grandpa had written, Community inside were decades of volunteer records. Letters from the public library, scholarship donations, food pantry receipts. Then Evelyn smiled. Your grandfather always said, if my family doesn't need what's left, my town probably will. None of us understood what she meant. Not yet. Evelyn opened the trust agreement, then read one paragraph aloud. If any beneficiary knowingly submits false financial disclosures, the disputed portion of that beneficiary's inheritance shall be redirected according to Schedule C. Dad frowned. Redirected where? Evelyn simply smiled. You'll find out after verification. The room became very quiet, because suddenly, being dishonest had consequences. Something unexpected happened. Nobody argued. Instead, Beckett quietly asked, Can I amend my disclosure? Delaney raised her hand. So can I. Dad nodded slowly. I'd like to update mine too. Grandpa had somehow created a system where telling the truth still mattered, not because people were forced to, because they were finally confronted with proof. If you believe honesty is worth more than any inheritance, comment, truth always wins. Before ending the meeting, Evelyn handed me another sealed note from Grandpa. Inside was only one sentence. The person I trusted most was always the one who treated me like family, even when there was nothing to gain. My eyes filled with tears. Then I remembered something. I had never once asked Grandpa about his money. We always talked about baseball, books, his garden, his coffee. Maybe that had been enough. Evelyn dimmed the lights. This is the last recording your grandfather asked me to play. The screen flickered. Grandpa appeared sitting on the porch of the lake cabin. He smiled exactly the way I remembered. Then he looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, my family is probably wondering who got what. He chuckled softly. Then his expression became serious. I spent my entire career balancing numbers. But people, they're harder to balance. He paused. Money doesn't change a family. It reveals the family that already exists. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away. A week later, every correction had been verified. Every receipt matched. Every journal entry lined up with bank records. Every canceled check told the same story. The estate was finally ready to be distributed. But before anyone received a single dollar, Evelyn quietly announced, "There is one final instruction your grandfather asked Marin to carry out." Every eye turned toward me. I slowly reached for the last sealed envelope. And I realized, Grandpa's greatest lesson wasn't about money. It was about what people become when they think nobody is keeping track. The room was completely silent. Attorney Evelyn Pierce placed Grandpa's final sealed envelope in front of me. This is the last instruction he left. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside wasn't another legal document. It was one handwritten page. At the top, Grandpa had written, "Marin, read this only after every record has been verified." I took a deep breath and began reading. I never wanted my family to fight over what I owned. I wanted them to remember how they treated people long before there was anything to inherit. I looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Then I read the next paragraph. If someone forgot the help I gave them, I understand. But if someone intentionally hid the truth, they've learned nothing from my life. Even Beckett lowered his head. For the first time, nobody cared about the money anymore. Evelyn stood and opened the estate ledger. Everything had been verified. Dad received exactly what Grandpa intended. Delaney received her portion. Beckett received his. Aunt Cynthia, Easton, everyone received their inheritance, but not everyone received the full amount they expected. The trust had worked exactly as Grandpa designed it. No punishment, only consequences for dishonesty. And because several disclosures had been intentionally incomplete, those forfeited amounts followed Grandpa's final instruction, not to another family member, to the Riverside Public Library, where Grandpa had volunteered for nearly 20 years. No one argued, because Grandpa himself had made that decision. A month later, the library invited me to a small dedication ceremony. The donation funded a new financial literacy center for teenagers. On the wall hung a simple plaque. In memory of Theodore Holloway, knowledge is the only inheritance that grows when it's shared. I stood there quietly smiling. Grandpa's final gift wasn't making our family richer. It was helping strangers build better futures. That felt exactly like him. A few days later, Dad asked if we could meet for coffee. He looked older, more tired. "I owe you an apology." I stayed quiet. He continued, "I kept thinking your grandfather trusted you because you were his favorite." He shook his head. "I finally realized. He trusted you because you never wanted anything from him." For the first time in years, I saw genuine humility in my father. A week later, Beckett knocked on my door. "I brought something." It was Grandpa's old toolbox. "I don't deserve this," he admitted. But I think Grandpa would have wanted the person who actually helped him fix things to have it. I smiled. I'll keep it. Not because it was valuable, because every scratch on it reminded me of afternoons spent beside Grandpa learning how to repair ordinary things. Those memories were priceless. That evening, I opened Grandpa's final journal. Tucked between 2 pages was a crisp $1 bill. Folded beside it was a tiny note. If you're holding this, you never stayed for the money. That's why I trusted you. I laughed through my tears. Grandpa always knew how to say everything with almost nothing. Months later, Mom visited my new house. She looked around quietly before asking, "Do you ever wish Grandpa had simply divided everything equally?" I thought about it, then shook my head. He did divide it fairly. He just believed honesty was part of fairness. Mom nodded slowly. For once, she didn't argue. People often ask what I inherited. The answer surprises them. Not the cabin, not the truck, not the biggest check. What I treasure most sits on a bookshelf in my living room. 12 handwritten journals, each one filled with ordinary days. Coffee conversations, doctor appointments, garden notes, birthday memories. They remind me that a meaningful life isn't built through dramatic moments. It's built through showing up, again and again. Sometimes I still think about that morning at the memorial. Everyone believed Grandpa's greatest treasure was locked inside bank accounts and property deeds. They were wrong. His greatest treasure was his integrity. He spent a lifetime proving that numbers matter. But character matters more. In the end, I didn't inherit the most money. I inherited the responsibility of protecting the truth. And looking back, that was worth more than every dollar he ever saved. Grandpa's estate didn't divide our family, it revealed it. And while everyone else searched for wealth, I walked away with the one thing money could never buy: his trust.